Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We are back. I'm actually happy that we are. The past couple weeks have been, in a certain sense, monumental, perhaps most significant moments in the 21st century, which of course is just beginning. Of course, the pandemic has not particularly abated. Oh, 1 second. We're okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. The pandemic is not particularly abated, but the world is opening up in places in a very controlled way and in places not in a controlled way. And so we see wild differences, not only in the response of different societies, but in the rates of infection throughout the world. It's still very dangerous. What we have found, though, and this is the terrible thing, is that instead of bringing everyone together, what this pandemic has done is actually separate people and has highlighted how the problems, I would say the tragedies of social differences actually are still very much another pandemic in the world, I would say. That's right. But what's happened the past 2 weeks, at least in the United States, and then with support throughout the world, is basically the beginning of what I hope will be a huge movement which will sustain and actually will have some effect to make the world better. And I think, and yet we have a president who instead takes pride in fostering division. Someone who called the 75-year-old man who had been pushed over and fell down in Buffalo and actually has brain damage because of that. He called him a terrorist who actually, in a certain sense, staged the event. It's remarkable. But there are actually weirdly funny, in a certain sense, little aspects of our administration and our president. It's very odd. For instance, the White House has planned a large rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma on June 19th. There's another reason why this is very significant, but one thing is that how should I say this? The president's campaign committee has actually written on their website is that, and I will read this, I said, by clicking the register below, you are acknowledging and that there's an inherent risk of exposure to COVID-19 in any place, and by attending this rally, you and any guests assume all risks related to exposure and agree not to hold Donald Trump responsible if you get sick. Excuse me, what's that? Okay? Yeah, sorry, I keep getting these messages, this little. As I mentioned, June 19th is a significant day because in Tulsa, back in 1921, that was the day when there was a huge massacre, actually, of Afro-Americans. That's it's called Juneteenth. It's a holiday, and it's for Afro-Americans, African Americans. It was to recognize the end of slavery. That way. But what happened at that time, there was a whole rampage in an area called Black Wall Street, and as many as 300 African Americans were killed. This is June 19th, the day that Trump, our president, has decided to host his rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Exactly where this happened. We'll see what happens there. Also, finally in this country, we have a significant movement to tear down monuments to people who have been considered to be heroes, but in fact were guilty of waging war against the United States. This was during the Civil War, of course. These people should be remembered, but they should be remembered as traitors guilty of treason, not as heroes. And yet, we do have, again, a president who has vowed to try to stop this movement. Anyway, enough of this. Okay, I'm going on and on and on because this is what I've been thinking about so much in the past little while. Okay, so I mentioned that I will be talking about Brahms. I will continue from my live stream a couple of weeks ago where I spoke about expression and structure. Now this is particularly apropos when talking about Brahms' music. But also, I have to say that Brahms is someone who comes to mind to me. 1 second, everything's okay. I keep worrying that things are not going right. But I think that I need maybe. Here. Thank you. Yeah. Because it's rather hot. Yeah. Anyway. Brahms was, in many senses, a Democrat. He was an agnostic. He was very much against I would say religious extremism. He was very much against the cult of Wagner. He was impressed with his music, and sometimes he was actually kind of envious about that. But what surrounded Wagner, and at that time, the anti-Semitism, which was what we had in Austria and Germany, especially throughout Europe, was something which was very much apparent, was brewing and became became actually completely very deadly, I would say. So I'm a bit tongue-tied today, so please bear with me. That he was so much anti this, all of this. One thing I should mention this is all in prelude, that in 1873, in Austria, the stock market crashed and caused a depression. And that, of course, led to people blaming, etc., especially the Jews, went to a significant rise in overt anti-Semitism in Vienna. Now, when Brahms actually talked about this to his friends, he was very upset about this, and in fact, there's a very kind of cute but poignant little thing which was written down by one of his guests. He said, in answer to the rise in anti-Semitism, he told them, he said, next week I'm going to have myself circumcised. In other words, this is in solidarity against what was happening. And when finally Karl Lueger and the Christian socialists were able to come to power in Vienna, in Austria, Brahms was furious about that. And again, he mentioned, he said, here, I will actually read this to you. He said, didn't I tell you years ago it was going to happen? You laughed at me then, and everybody else did too. Now it's here, and with its came the priest's economic system. If there was an anti-clerical party, that would make sense to me, but anti-Semitism is madness. I give you one more quote about Brahms, which is something that, in a way, is very dear to me. And this was a quotation of that, not a quotation, something that Dvorak mentioned to Joseph Suk after he had met with Brahms. He spent an afternoon with Brahms, and then later saw Suk, and they were talking, and all of a sudden he blurted out, apparently, he says, about Brahms, he says, such a man is such a fine soul, and yet he believes in nothing. Of course, that's not at all true. But what he believed in was in humanity, not in something external to humanity, which you have to look up to. You have to actually kowtow to. And that makes him an important person for me, at least right now. Okay. Also about Brahms, I should say that he has the reputation of being a big conservative. Of course, you have Brahms' article, Schoenberg's article, Brahms the Progressive, where he showed that in certain cases he was very harmonically progressive, etc., etc., etc. But I would say that Brahms was very progressive, and he had, in his own way, a big effect on music after his time, even though that effect was probably by no means overt. And that is because in his music, although he used, in a certain way I should say, standard forms, his forms were generated by motives, by gestures, even sort of even not really even motives. And you have a sense of parallelism between what is very small in the pieces and very large. And this is something which, of course, at the time of Brahms was completely not, or what should I say? You see, I'm very tongue-tied today. At the time of Brahms, people did not actually recognize this, I believe. The sense that in a certain way, the music of Brahms deals in fractals. And I will show that to you in certain examples in a minute. Also, I would say that Brahms was very interested in what was happening around him. He was interested not only in the history of music. In Bach, he was probably, at his time, the greatest scholar of the Baroque. But he was also interested in folk music. He was interested in popular music. That's why you see how he incorporated the gypsy music and Hungarian music, let's say, folk music. And at the end of his life, and this is something I'm going to quote from a very nice biography that this is, it's called Johannes Brahms, a biography by Jan Swafford. And it has some very, very nice material. And this is something that I've been looking for a while, and I found here, and that was great. So I have to see, this is page 564. Yeah. And he said, it was at a party in those years that he heard, this is in actually 1891 to 94. He doesn't give an exact date for this in this. It was at a party in those years that he heard a young American woman playing a ragtime tune on a banjo. To a friend, Brahms recalled the evening wistfully, humming a few bars of what may have been "Hello, My Baby." I'm not sure about any of this, actually, except the fact that he did hear this woman. He was fascinated by the effect of the instrument and by the dancing syncopations of this new American style. Instinctively, he saw its rhythm as a fresh resource, as gypsy music had been for his generation, but now he was too old to do anything about it. I think that shows that our friend Jan Swafford, who knows a lot about Brahms music, unfortunately was not very familiar with the clarinet sonatas. Because here, of course, Brahms did utilize this basic ragtime rhythm, of course, in a completely different way than there was ragtime. But this is a very nice quote. And as I said, I had been looking for this for a long time because I had heard about this, but I never saw it cited in any kind of a source. So I don't know about My Baby, but anyway, the first thing I will do is show in Brahms, of course, in the first movement of the F minor sonata, you have this here. And then here. That way. And then, of course, in the second sonata, you have it even more overt. I should find, although I really don't need it, but you have here. exactly this ragtime rhythm, which, in fact, we would think that maybe this was something which was kind of either special or something that maybe, you know, it was Brahms just happened upon it and he just heard this maybe this one time. But in fact, ragtime music, starting in the 1890s, from perhaps even 1889 in Europe, has become more and more and more popular. And not only that, but the banjo was an instrument which was, in a certain way, taking Europe by storm at that time, I would say. And for that, I want to actually play a little something for you, because some of the very first recordings were actually of banjo. So here, and this I want to do, this is, there are early recordings, but I like this because it's so great. This is, there's a banjo virtuoso, Wes Osman, 1907, and playing together with his little combo, the Maple Leaf Rag of Scott Joplin, which I believe Scott actually was published in 1899, just a little while before that. Okay, so this is 10 years after the death of Brahms, of course, but you could hear in his playing maybe something of what he heard and what impressed him. Okay, let me try to get this to work. This is a mom and pop operation here. And let's see. Okay. Let's see what happens here. I'm going to try and hope this works. That's one thing. And also, you know, the ragtime music in general, not simply with the banjo, was very, very popular, I have to say. So I play a bit of one more selection, and this is one of the very first recordings. It was the Peerless Orchestra from New Orleans, 1900. This would be. This is only 3 years, of course, after the death of Brahms. And here we have it, My Tiger Lily. $1,900. Yeah, that's really quite something. Yeah. And here we have 1899. Whistling Rufus. Yeah, you can hardly hear the whistling though. It's very funny. Okay, that's so. This is a bit of what very possibly Brahms actually heard. Not simply this lady playing the banjo, but a lot of ragtime in the streets and the cafes of Vienna. Okay, I will, before I go to the piano and actually look at these pieces, I will actually do a few more quotes and explanations. This is a lot of this I mentioned earlier, but I'd like to mention this again. And first of all, I a quote from Richard Specht, actually. It was a critic in Vienna about how Brahms played. He said the whole person was in his playing, and also the whole work. One seemed to possess it from that moment on, inalienably so. With all Brahms' control and restraint, there was in this playing a singing and surging, a flitting of lights on a scurrying of shadows, a glowing and a dying away, self-possessed manly emotion, and self-forgetful romantic passion. Playings of such immediacy and individuality as I have never heard from anyone else. He also played as if alone. He forgot the audience entirely, lost to himself and to others. In such recreative interpretation, too, the whole person was there. He was fully himself in everything he did and lived every moment with utmost intensity. And about his conducting, the composer Charles Stanford, who himself was called perhaps the English Brahms, so he was a very, very good composer, wrote in his diary, Brahms' tempo was very elastic, but he never allowed his liberties with the time to interfere with the general balance. They were of the true nature of rubato. He loathed having his slow movements played in an inexorable four square. Now, I will also just quote one thing that Brahms wrote, actually, to the violinist of a quartet who was asking for the correct tempo for the last movement of his second string quartet. That's Opus 51, number 2. It's A minor. His name was Alvin von Beckerath. And this is what Brahms wrote. In your case, I can quite easily start you on a subscription for metronome markings. You pay me a tidy sum, and each week I deliver to you different numbers. For with normal people, they cannot remain valid for more than a week. And this came out of von Beckerath was the second violinist, and the first violinist had mentioned to him that he didn't like the tempo that Beckerath had established. So they had a kind of argument about tempo. That's why Beckerath actually approached Brahms for this. And the final thing which Brahms wrote to him, incidentally, you are right about the tempo, and the first violin as well. So, the interesting thing to me is why Brahms felt this way about tempo. It's not simply that, oh, today I feel this way, today I feel that way. No, although that does play a part, I think, in everybody's life and everybody's, of our as musicians, in our playing and our interpretations of pieces. That's absolutely for sure. But this elastic tempo had to do with the fact that the way Brahms composed, he had small things which then evolved into large things this way. So his music, in his mind, had this kind of feeling of breadth, or I should also say, the sense of fractals, where you have the small and then the larger and the larger, and they should be connected, of course, but not in a way which is in a certain way metronomic, but in a way which brings out in fact, the emotion which the structure creates. Now, I hope that sort of makes sense. Anyway, I will also mention, going on a little more about his actual markings, because this is important as musicians that we are to actually show what, to understand, I should say, what Brahms was showing. You see, I'm not doing so well with language today, somehow. That's funny. Everyone laughs, I'm sure. Now, these signs, these hairpins, I should say, as I had mentioned earlier, have a lot to do with time, and the wonderful pianist Fanny Davies is a great source of information about this. And one of her quotations in her diary today, that she writes, the sign, this actually double hairpin, as is used by Brahms, often occurs when he wishes to express great sincerity and warmth, allied not only to tone, but to rhythm also. He would linger not on one note alone, but on a whole idea, as if to tear himself away, unable, I'm really not doing well. I'm going to say this again. So we go back.
You live too long to the Japanese woman.
I know. My brain thinks in too many different languages, and English tends to be not the first one sometimes, even though it's my native language. That's funny. So this sign, the double hairpin, as used by Brahms, often occurs when he wishes to express great sincerity and warmth, allied not only to tone, but to rhythm also. He would linger not on one note alone, but on a whole idea, as if unable to tear himself away from its beauty. He would prefer to lengthen a bar or phrase rather than spoil it by making up the time into a metronomic bar. And again, this is this whole idea of taking something that's small and making it larger. And then when you make it larger, the expression becomes larger also, not simply the metronomic value. And this is what is very important. You know, there are many things about the way Brahms used dynamics, etc., and I'm not really going to go into them right now. But the one thing I do want to emphasize is if you look at the clarinet sonatas, and this is not actually reserved only for them, it's not limited only for them, I should say, but you will find that he almost never uses words like tenuto or ritarando, that way, or accelerando. He uses hairpins. That way. That's, the F minor sonata, collando is the one, and that appears only once at the end of the third movement. Of course, it happens just at the very end of that, not even before. And that sort of makes sense. In the E-flat sonata, ritarando and collando appear only twice in the whole piece. And that's it. Instead, he used hairpins to indicate an overall flexibility in the music. Okay, and now I think I should probably go and actually explain sort of what I mean by all this, or what I should say, what Brahms means by this. And I will give measure numbers. I want to look at the E-flat sonata now and show some, I think, very interesting aspects of this. This is in the first movement of this sonata, and I come here with this here, because I have measure numbers, so I may read from the other one. One thing Brahms does in this is he first plants a very small idea, which can seem quite insignificant at the time, but then that idea he later expands into something very important for this piece. So one thing we can see is this here. Just those three notes. And that happens here, as we have with this part here. Then we have and then we have here. And then we have here. So these three notes here, and he does outline them or emphasize them with the hairpin, which very clearly shows the trajectory, or I should say the build up to here, and then there. Now, what does he do a little bit later? We moved after here to this place. And then we have this. Then we have this. And then we go to there. So what is that? He disguises this by putting the clarinet up an octave. You see. But this, again, is not something that has come out of the blue, sort of, or all of a sudden you thought, oh, maybe I'll just write something like that. I thought, well, that's kind of cute. Yeah. No. It comes out of that motive or this gesture, which is there and should stay in our memory, in a way, and then expands so that we have the next one, next one. Becomes a place which is rather monumental. Let's look at another place here, which is perhaps even more subtle than that one, because there at least he actually marks that with these hairpins, which should actually represent, at least to performers, that, oh, this is something significant. Okay, we go on, and we have this place here, going right after that from the bottom. This kind of dance, or almost waltz-like. actually turn into in this piece? It turns into the most, perhaps, significant moment in the whole work. It becomes the basic structural progression of just about the entire development section of the piece, which starts here as we go from this place we end up here, and then he just has this party with very unusual for Brahms, where you just have the color of harmony. So we had G major. Anticipates this in the most subtle way possible. Okay? And what is this very innocuous, very small little gesture turns into something which actually is the centerpiece of the whole work, this whole movement. It's quite remarkable as a sense of generation of form from the smallest element. Do we have a question? Yeah. It's Fanny Davies, the pianist. Oh, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, what is the source of quote about Brahms' approach to the double hairpin? This is the pianist Fanny Davies. Kept notes about Brahms' performance. And there are especially detailed notes about his performance. Actually, it was his reading of the C minor trio with Hausmann and Joachim. And in her notebook, that's what she wrote. There are many other things that she wrote, but that's very notable little quotation, which I think is quite explicit. So is there anything else that I should? Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
But maybe not the question. This is not English.
Let me see. Where's this? No, I think that one I should answer by separately. It's not that.
You were so close.
Yeah, I know. My stomach is close. Okay, so I show this to you this way. Yeah. Something else? Is there?
That's it.
No, that's it. Okay. Okay, so this is just one little example. There are others as well, but I'm not going to go through the whole thing. That doesn't necessarily make so much sense. But what I want to do now is actually show how he develops and how he again takes a small, and this comes right in this same place. So we have this. So this gesture here, there. Then he goes on, of course that way, and then he has to, and then again, and then continues. And then he could continue, but then he goes, and we have, and here, so in this, again, motive, again forms a seed which he expands until to this place here. This is another great example of the way he takes something small and expands until it again becomes something very, in this piece, quite grand, I would say. Okay. Now we can move to the basic structure of this piece and see what it, again, it is quite interesting. And if we remember how the middle part of this piece, the basic body of the development, is by and large in G major. Now we are in E flat in this piece. And again, people who I've already spoken about this to, who are listening, please my apologies if you're hearing all of this for the umpteenth time, but I'm sure that there are many people who have not. And that's why I'm doing this. So, in this piece, my biggest question for a long time was, why did Brahms feel the necessity, oh, I'm not doing well, to have so many measures at the end of this movement in E flat? Okay. And again, it's full 8 measures of just E flat major, which, as I hear many performances, it sounds rather boring. Yeah. But it should not be, I think. But the most important way is, why does Brahms feel that it is so necessary to do that? And for that we have to look in the piece, and we can see something very interesting, that right before this we have this. And then he goes on. Oh, sorry. And then he could have finished in E major. Many people probably wouldn't have known the difference. But this is very significant in this piece. And before I actually talk about this again, or explain this in more detail, what I'm talking about, I have to go back to the first sonata. Because that sonata and the second sonata he wrote together, and they are very, very different, of course, but they deal with, in a way, it's the same fundamental issues of music for Brahms. This is this issue of the half step. That way. And in this first sonata, I'm sort of looking at this new edition here. Oh, I should mention measure numbers. I should do that, yes. I'm sorry about that, but hopefully this was all quite clear to people who know the piece. As we start here, this is the very beginning. This is, I had mentioned how this is actually a chorale motif. But the important thing is how Brahms brings out two half steps. So, there's the air, and then so we have this, and every aspect of this first movement, and not only this first movement, but all the movements, in fact, revolve around these two half steps. And these two half steps have many different implications. They have implication of two fundamental, I should say, aspects of harmonic language. And for this is something that we actually have to go back forward to Schoenberg, who is in his harmony Lehre. He actually mentions that for him, not for him, but as he shows in a certain way that the fundamental progression is not to the dominant, but is to the median. So in other words, if you have C major, you would go to the median here, and then from there we go to A flat and back to C. And what that does is this. up the median outlines, and so you have a whole tone scale which is 6 notes. And then you have the leftover notes, which are another 6, which actually that. Okay? And you're wondering, what does this have to do with anything? But bear with me. Okay, anyway, we go back to this half step. Okay, here. And in this beginning of the F minor sonata, we have. But every time in this melody that Brahms tries to move to a resolution, where he falls in the wrong place, it's into deceptive cadence, because of the change of half step. So instead of the C, D flat, and then we're in the F as part of B flat minor, the F turns into G flat, and then should be that, but no, again D flat, and then finally there. And this tension in the first movement of half step we see all over the place. We see here G flat, D flat, there, throughout here. Not only that, we are in F minor, but all of a sudden, from here, and of course, he then emphasizes this in great thing here, where we are in F sharp minor. And then should go from there to F minor. So we have the tension between this and that. Okay. Now I won't go through the other movements of this piece, but we will find that these F, G flat, C to D flat are throughout this. Now let's go to the second sonata. We'll go back. I will jump around a bit here, but the second sonata, this first movement again, we're in E flat here, right? But the question is, why, where, why does he move to E major there? So we have E flat and E major there. We look carefully and remember the G major that's here. what we see in this piece is that in what Brahms is doing is he has two tonal directions that he's moving to. And remember that we look at Brahms as the conservative. But in fact, we see what is happening. He has exactly his motion that way. But what is much more pronounced is moving from here to here, then motion going through G major to B major, as we can see right here, as we have here. To B major. This goes into measure 120 at that point. And then that he resolves in E major. So in this movement, as opposed to the first movement, where you have this, in a certain tension between these two, here I wouldn't say there's this tension in the same way, but what you have is a kind of divergence of tonality in this, which then he finally, just like he does in the first sonata, he resolves, in this case, from here but not in a tragic way, but in a way which creates this great feeling of relief in a kind of breath. It's very, very interesting. And the emotion that's involved in both of these for performers is something that we have to try to communicate to people who are listening when we're playing this piece, which then makes both of these movements, the first movement of the F minor sonata and this first movement of the E flat, very, very special. Okay, I think that I keep babbling on, so I have two things I just want to ask, which is going to the second movements of each piece. Okay, and I first start here in the E flat. We have this here, and one thing I would just like to point out is we have this. There we have in this movement our tension between F and G flat from the first movement. There, that G flat. And then this whole melody, G flat, F, G flat, G flat, and F together. Then G flat. And going on, we have here, going to his G flat and D flat, D flat. So this whole second movement comes right out of the first movement of the F minor sonata. And the marking Allegro appassionato is not a mistake or something which Brahms casually actually applied to this, but expresses this connection. Okay, I still have to go on a little longer, and that's hopefully I'm not too. Another question. Here we go. Yeah, this is so median chords not pivoting to somewhere, but being a moment of release. I think that's in many ways right, but I will. This is from my great friend Harimaki. Yes, I think I will talk to you in more detail about that because it probably will take about an hour by itself. Anyway, but that's true. But the point of the importance of median direction is the issue of common tones and how connecting by common tones has been a way since the very beginning until now that in fact people have constructed pieces of music. Okay, so I have one more thing to show in this second movement. There's, again, a lot to do, but anyway. And it has to do with this. And here I show both the issue of these markings, these hairpins, and also the sense of, if we understand feeling of structure, how we can actually show the emotion that's in this passage. And it is this, which is a very odd melody, to say the least, you know. You know, it's like, huh? How did Brahms get that? Okay, so that's a question. And this is an important thing that I want to mention. When, as musicians, when we look at music, we have to ask questions. We have to say, why is it so, eh? And the answers we find can lead to more expressive, more compelling performance. They may not be correct. Correctness may not even be the important thing about them. Okay, now with that said, I may not be correct either. I may have just completely misinterpreted what Brahms had in mind, of course, or maybe Brahms himself didn't quite know what he had in mind. That's also very possible. That's a topic for another live stream, of course. But now going back, there's another interesting little detail, which is here, the end of the first movement. Brahms does not have an E flat, a tonic, in the piano part. And of course, he doesn't have any pedal markings throughout the piece. So it is possible that he just assumed, sorry, wow, I don't understand what's happening to me. So that way, so we can keep the E flat from there. But it is interesting that he didn't bother to write in the piano the E flat at the end. It's also historically interesting because afterwards, if you see, there are some sonatas written after Brahms by people who obviously knew his music, and they also often do not have in the end of the first movement the tonic in obviously people saw this and, wow, this is kind of a cool thing. In any case, I'm looking at that and I'm wondering, that's interesting. And of course, what we see is that. Okay, so these two movements are connected, it seems. And the question is, how are they connected? And if we look at that, we see that the first movement is actually an E flat major scale. Now the second movement is an E flat minor scale, going down. And we see that here. And then here, there's our G flat, and it continues, if I'm not going to play, but you can find each of the notes going down all the way to the end of the phrase. To this. There. Now the question is, what is the relationship between major and minor? The minor is the inversion of the major. That's why if we have this, invert that way, we get minor. So, this second movement we can look at as an inversion, in a way, of the first movement. And so, again, Brahms is, in these pieces, these two sonatas, is actually involved in very fundamentals of music. These connections. Now, we go back to this. There. And wonder, why does he like or need this melody? We have that sixth, of course, there, but it doesn't seem so significant. It's a little bit, but let's look at this more carefully. First of all, what he could have done is this. If we have this, and we have here, and then we have this here, and what would be typical to do is simply and then that would lead, of course, right to here. That way. But Brahms is a little more complicated than that. And what he does, instead of just having the clarinet repeat, he cuts it. And then the piano picks that up here. And then expands that. And then goes to there, this way. So he takes this motive and then sort of stretches it in the middle, that way. But it's not so simple as that, because that's still wondering. Why does he do that? Okay, now we have to go to the first movement. And we have this. occurs about a quarter of the way through the piece. Although earlier, goes to there, but here, this is in this body. If we just look at the ABA at the A section of this piece, this work also occurs about a quarter of the way through this. We have this happening. Right there, which is, you can say it's the retrograde, but also the inversion, we can say, of that. So in connecting the two movements, Brahms is thinking of this, but since this is the inversion, it has to be that way. So this is how he actually accomplishes this very subtle and fascinating connection between these two movements. So I believe here, so we have he points that out here, and we should have, again, kind of memory, unconscious probably memory, of what happened earlier in this piece. Now we go as performers, and we have these markings here. Now if we think of these markings as more tenuto and expression, rather than that way, which is very odd, then we can understand this kind of. So we feel that would be normal, but instead, and then instead you're pushed. First movement. And then we go to there. You see? And I think this little odd 4 measures become something which is actually quite significant in this piece. Okay, there's so many more things to discuss in this, but I'd go back because I want to, I don't want to leave this dangling. Like that, and that, those two things. And we go to the second movement of the first sonata here, and we have, again, progression here, which goes from A flat, well, that's not A, that's E flat, but we need A flat. What am I doing? We have A flat here, and then from there goes to E major, to C major, and back to A flat, in this here. Okay? So that is the overall harmonic form of this movement. As we move, and of course, that outlines, or going, let's say going down, we can go going down. That way. Now let's go to this part here. That way. in this piece, this motion, just like in the first movement, going from in a certain way, that way, that we have in the first movement. In the subtlest way possible. Then also we have here this going from there. And then kind of, even I say that I look at it as a kind of exegesis in a way, a kind of a pondering of each of these notes, the meaning of each of those in the chorale, which meant so much to Brahms from the St. Matthew Passion. And I think I've overstayed my welcome quite a bit. And I have to say that I wanted to move on to just segue to another topic, which is a little introduction to the great clarinetist and saxophonist Sidney Bechet, who was born just a month after Brahms died, and who, among people who know jazz, of course, he's very well known, but in the general public, he has been very much forgotten, but yet he was a major force, not only in the jazz world, but as someone who influenced music in the 20th century. And, of course, Brahms missed him, but other very important composers did not. So I think that that's what I will do in my next stream. But what I'd like to do is end this totally different with a tiny bit of Bechet. Let me see. I have to get this here. Find it. Yeah, here. And this is together. He's together with Louis Armstrong in 1924. This is in a band sort of led by Clarence Williams at that time, in 1924. And here, this is the end of it. And here he actually plays. I'm just going to play because it's just fantastic. He plays a sarrusophone, which is a very odd instrument, and I'll talk more about that next week. But anyway, here, let's see if we can do this. Let's see if this is done. I'm in the wrong place. I'm not very adept. Yeah, should work. Here we go. Okay. Thanks for bearing with me. Be well, and see you next week. Thank you.